We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
Thank you all for joining me for this discussion. We're going to talk today about psychedelic drugs. I'm going to try to bring you through a brief history of psychedelic drugs and then discuss what they are, what they may do to the mind and the brain, and end with a reflection on what that might mean for consciousness and understanding ourselves. But let's start at the beginning. What are psychedelic drugs? The word psychedelic can be defined in lots of different ways. One definition is of or noting a mental state characterized by a profound sense of intensified sensory perception, sometimes accompanied by severe perceptual distortion and hallucinations, and by extreme feelings of either euphoria or despair. That may be true for many people who experience the effects of psychedelic drugs, but it isn't quite in keeping with the original intention of the person who first coined that word psychedelic. The word psychedelic was first coined by Humphrey Osmond, who was an English psychiatrist who was expatriated to Canada and who, along with Abraham Hoffer, was one of the first people to give LSD to patients diagnosed with alcoholism and one of the first to administer LSD within a clinical setting. Osmond had tried LSD himself, and he also had shared LSD and other similar drugs, such as mescaline, which comes from psychoactive cacti. Osmond notably shared mescaline with Aldous Huxley, who's a famous novelist and philosopher who then went on to pen The Doors of Perception based on his experiences with psychedelic drugs. But all of this is to say that Osmond really explored the effects of psychedelic drugs, such as LSD, to try to understand how they work, what their impact was, and how they may be therapeutic, or whether or not they may be helpful for patients with various disorders. And he coined this word psychedelic, which has interesting roots in etymology. It's based on the root psyche, meaning mind, and also delos, meaning manifest. He believed that LSD in particular, but also psychedelic drugs more broadly, manifested aspects of the mind that may or may not be accessible to people. And it was through this mind manifestation that the drugs had their therapeutic value. There are a number of drugs that fall broadly under the umbrella term psychedelic, but only a subset of those really hold together as classic psychedelics. These are contained in a number of pharmacological classes, including tryptamines, phenethylamines, and ergolines. Under tryptamines, we find a number of drugs, including psilocybin and psilocin, which are found in many species of psychoactive mushroom. Also, dimethyltryptamine, which is one of the active components of ayahuasca. Dimethyltryptamine can be found in many plant sources. In the phenethylamines, we have mescaline, which is found in psychoactive cacti. We also have a number of other drugs, including the research chemical 2,4-B. And under ergolines, we have the infamous lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. Also, some more naturally occurring ergolines, such as lysergic acid amide, or LSA, which has many plant sources. All of these drugs are, unfortunately, share the characteristic of being a Schedule 1 compound, which means they're heavily controlled drugs. But they also share the property of being serotonin 2A receptor agonists. And throughout many decades of research, we now believe that this serotonin 2A receptor partial agonism is responsible for all of the things that we attribute to psychedelic drugs. From a brief historical perspective, there's anthropological evidence of ceremonial consumption of hallucinogenic plants and fungal matter in the past few centuries. And there's also speculation that ceremonial use of similar psychoactive compounds may date back many thousand years. Some of this evidenced by artifacts or cave drawings. One cave drawing attributed to psychedelic use in spiritual or quasi-religious ceremonial contexts is the mushroom man. This is a humanoid figure upon which is growing from almost every surface what look like mushroom-like figures. Mushrooms of the psilocybe genus are found on all continents, and the ceremonial use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms by indigenous tribes in Mexico can be traced back at least to the 15th century. And at least 9 indigenous groups in Mexico have been identified that still consume psychedelic psilocybin mushrooms in the ceremonial context. So there does seem to be some evidence suggesting that the use of psychedelic drugs in various contexts, mostly religious or quasi-spiritual or ritual contexts, does have a historical basis and is not just a recent affectation of human experience. But how did these drugs come to kind of modern Western society? Well, mainly through 2 routes. One was through the experience of Gordon Wasson, who went to Mexico searching out the magic mushroom, found a group of people using the mushrooms, and found Maria Sabina, who was a famous mushroom shaman, and she brought Gordon Wasson and his wife through a mushroom ceremony. He took many pictures and took notes and wrote stories about that and brought that back to the United States, and that was published as an article in Time magazine. That whole train of events was one way that psychedelics were brought to American consciousness. Another way was through the discovery of LSD by Albert Hofmann in Sandoz Laboratories, and then the subsequent dissemination of LSD throughout medical and also research labs and government agencies throughout the United States and throughout the world. So these 2 routes were 2 of the main routes by which psychedelics were brought to the United States. And shortly after these really caught on, many thousands of individuals went through research and therapeutic trials in the 50s and 60s. These trials mainly involved LSD, but also involved psilocybin, mescaline, and possibly other compounds. These compounds were studied for a variety of reasons to try to understand and to treat mood disorders, psychosis, addiction, palliative care situations, and to treat and understand pain. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these studies were conducted with what we would consider to be unacceptable scientific rigor, inadequate control conditions. But all of this came to a screeching halt with the Controlled Substances Act of 1971. Since then, really beginning in the 90s and then beginning to take off in the 2000s, there's been a recent research of both basic and clinical human studies on the effects of these drugs. So now we're beginning to build a modern and contemporarily defensible base of empirical evidence to try to understand truly what these drugs may or may not do. So what do these drugs do, at least acutely? When you think about or hear the word hallucinogen or psychedelic, the first thing that typically pops into people's minds is all of these various visual effects, such as geometric or kaleidoscopic or fractal shapes and patterns superimposed on the visual field, or maybe changes in the perception of depth or colors being more vibrant or rich, edges being more salient, and even illusory movements such as in things seeming to move that aren't actually moving in the environment, like walls breathing or carpets dancing or faces melting, or we're seeing even visual trails. All of these are typically what come to people's mind first when they think of hallucinogens or psychedelics. But I'd argue these are among the least interesting of the acute effects of these drugs. Despite some claims that psychedelics may enhance cognition or enhance consciousness, recent evidence from our lab and others has shown that, if anything, psychedelics acutely lead to a mild to moderate but detectable impairment in certain cognitive processes, such as working and episodic memory, executive function, associative learning, and psychomotor performance. Psychedelics may seem, in many cases, to have maybe a more positive acute effect on emotions. Outside of the context of a challenging experience or a bad trip, it seems that on average, psychedelics may lead to a slight increase in positive mood and a slight decrease in negative mood, as well as no change or an increase in your ability to detect positively valenced emotional information in the environment, and a slight reduction or impairment in your ability to sense or detect, or your sensitivity to negative emotional information in the environment. We've recently also demonstrated that a single high dose of psilocybin administered to healthy individuals can lead to sustained changes in emotional function in these dimensions. So a single high dose of psilocybin administered to healthy individuals was shown to lead to a reduction in negative emotions for at least a week after psilocybin administration, and an increase in positive mood and positive affect for at least a month after psilocybin, as well as changes in brain function related to these emotional processes that persisted for at least a week after psilocybin administration. There also seems to be a really unique and peculiar interaction of psilocybin, not only with visual field phenomena, but also with music. There are, I believe, the vast majority of clinical trials that are being conducted today with psychedelic drugs are being conducted with some form of music as an adjunct to the therapeutic intervention. My colleagues and I have recently shown that psychedelics can increase the positive emotions that can be encountered during music listening. We've also demonstrated that music listening can increase the communication of brain regions involved in memory and visualization, which may or may not lead some kind of credence in some biological explanation to some of the strong visual effects that people can experience specifically during music listening, but also auditory to visual synesthesia that has been reported by some during psychedelic experiences. I also recently demonstrated that LSD can increase the degree to which the brain tracks the time-varying tonal structure of music during music listening. So it's almost as if LSD is turning up the gain on the units in the brain that are really processing the abstract structure of music. And this may be one of the reasons why music seems so much more vibrant, or so much easier to engage in deep listening of music when we're experiencing the effects of psychedelic drugs. Psychedelics have also recently been shown to possibly be therapeutic for a number of indications. There's evidence showing that administration of psilocybin specifically can lead to sharp decreases in depression and anxiety in patients who are suffering from late stage cancer. We've shown that psilocybin administration can lead to a sharp reduction in clinician rated depression severity in patients with major depressive disorder. It can also help in a pretty profound way to help people quit smoking. In an open label pilot study conducted by my colleagues Matt Johnson and Al Garcia-Romu, they showed after 2 to 3 administrations of psilocybin, a number of people who had a really profound smoking habit were able to quit smoking. And 10 weeks and then 6 months after that intervention, over 80% of the individuals in that study were abstinent cigarettes. Finally, a similarly impressive effect has been shown by our colleague Mike Bogenschutz at NYU, who administered psilocybin within a course of treatment for alcohol use disorder and saw a precipitous drop in number of days drinking and number of heavy days drinking in these individuals. So overall, we see that psychedelics may have powerful acute effects. They may also have the potential for powerful therapeutic effects, and psilocybin therapy and psychedelic therapy more broadly may lead to an abrupt and profound restructuring of behavioral, cognitive, and emotional states. It can really potentially allow patients access to a broadened behavioral repertoire to help them recover from seemingly wide variety of illnesses. But a natural question then arises, well, how might psychedelics do all these things? What might the mechanisms underlying these changes be? Well, there's one aspect of psychedelic experience that we haven't really discussed yet, and that's the aspect of peak experiences. Peak experiences have been described in a variety of different ways. One way to describe these experiences has been using the term ego dissolution, or whatever you believe the ego is or consider the ego to be, that kind of goes away and isn't present anymore for some period of time during psychedelic experiences. Another kind of conceptualization of this has been that of a mystical experience. And I'll be the first to admit that there is a failure in marketing here. The word mystical can mislead a lot of people. It can seem like something that is just, can't be touched. It's like mist, or maybe it's something that only a scarce few individuals can ever achieve. But really, it has an operational definition that began its formulation about over 100 years ago. In his book, Varieties of Religious Experiences, William James published and wrote an entire chapter on mystical experiences, which he believed could possibly be experiences that are trans-religious, trans-cultural, and had a number of core features. Stace picked up on this idea, and Stace was a philosopher of religion. And in 1960, he published a book on mystical experiences that really tried to bring more kind of solidification to this idea. He read and reviewed as many religious and cultural and spiritual texts and non-spiritual texts that he could, and tried to identify experiences that fit this definition of mystical experience. He then tried to look for similarities between all of these experiences and identified a number of dimensions of experience that seemed to hold these experiences together, that being some form of feeling of unity of self and others, or unity between the self and the world or the universe, really a breaking down of barriers between self and other. These experiences seem to have a noetic quality. In other words, seem to be more real or more true than other experiences that people have in normal waking consciousness. They seem to have an element of sacredness or reverence. They involved deeply felt positive mood. They had an aspect of ineffability, or really the inability to truly be expressed and explained and described using words. And finally, this element of transcendence of time and space, such that time and space didn't seem to exist during these mystical experiences. We've created a questionnaire that tries to probe, self-report endorsement of having experienced any number of these dimensions. And when we score that questionnaire, we find that the score on the mystical experience questionnaire seems to follow a really reliable dose-dependent fashion, such that with greater dose of psilocybin specifically, we see greater scores on this mystical experience questionnaire. Indeed, scores on this mystical experience questionnaire seem to correlate well with a number of other meaningful constructs, such as self-reported meaningfulness of the experience, as well as the self-reported spiritual significance of the experience, such that lower values of mystical experience questionnaire scores are correlated with people saying that the experience they had was similar to experiences that occur once every 5 years, or once a year, or once a month, or even once a week. Whereas very high scores on the mystical experience questionnaire are correlated with responses such as, this may have been among the top 5 or the single most meaningful experience of my life that I encountered under the acute effects of this drug. And similar for ratings of spiritual significance of the experiences. So higher mystical experience questionnaire scores correlated with ratings of the experience being among the top 5 or the single most spiritually significant experience of a person's life. We've also found that mystical experience scores correlate reasonably well, with reductions in depression and reductions in anxiety that are encountered after psychedelic experiences. And my colleagues have found that greater mystical experience scores were correlated with reduction in craving, an increase in confidence to abstain, and a decrease in the temptation to smoke when trying to treat smokers with psychedelics, specifically psilocybin. So this psychological experience, this construct of mystical experience, and more broadly, the subjective experiences that people may encounter during psychedelic experiences, may themselves be related to these therapeutic outcomes that we're beginning to observe and understand in relation to psychedelic therapy. But there are other potential mechanisms and explanations of what psychedelics may be doing that can have a therapeutic output or a therapeutic value. These are preliminary data from a study that we recently published in patients with major depressive disorder. These patients saw a remarkable and a somewhat durable reduction in depression severity after treatment with psilocybin. And within these patients, we also saw a reduction in perseverative errors on a cognitive flexibility test that's similar to the Wisconsin card sort test. So in this test, basically, we're asking people to learn a set of rules, and then those rules change, and then they have to relearn the new rule, and then the rules change again. And the degree to which people perseverate on previous rules is basically understood as a measure of cognitive inflexibility. So after psilocybin therapy, individuals in this study saw an improvement in cognitive flexibility. In a separate survey study, we found that while psychedelic drugs may involve and may evoke mystical experiences as well as psychological insights, it was actually increases in psychological flexibility that resulted from these psychedelic experiences that mediated the effects of mystical experience on decreases in depression and anxiety. So from a neurocognitive perspective, it may be this cognitive flexibility or psychological flexibility that is underlying the therapeutic changes that we see with psychedelic drugs. And finally, we can talk about some of the biology underlying psychedelic drugs. There are maybe 3 models of psychedelic drug effects in the brain that are emerging and that may go some distance to explaining how psychedelic drugs work, both acutely and in terms of a therapeutic effect. One of the models that's developing is really focused on the action of and the importance of the default mode network. So this default mode network is a network of brain regions that are variously involved in self-referential processing, self-related thoughts and cognitions. One of the brain regions, the posterior cingulate, it can often be found to be active when people are asking questions such as, does this adjective describe me? Or is this face mine or not? And the medial prefrontal cortex, which is another node within the default mode network, is a brain region that's often found to be involved in autobiographical memory, self-related emotions, emotional learning, and also theory of mind, my theory of your mind, thinking about how someone else thinks or thinking about how you think, some of these metacognitive processes. And these are brain regions that have been variably shown to be turned off during the effects of psychedelic drugs. And in particular, our colleagues in London have shown a number of times that activity and connectivity within brain regions within the default mode network is actually correlated with ego dissolution, such that the greater the ego dissolution, the more these things are turned down. And the idea here, roughly speaking, is that there may be kind of disorganization or some kind of interruption of brain regions that are involved in self-referential processing that accompany these ego dissolutive experiences. If you can expand your understanding of ego dissolution and mystical experiences to encompass spiritual experiences, there have also been studies demonstrating a correlation between increase of this spiritual experience or mystical experience and decrease in synchrony of brain regions involved in the default mode network. There's another model altogether that involves the regulation of sensory information through the thalamus that has been proposed to underlie some of the effects of psychedelic drugs. And some evidence has been shown that, in fact, this may be the case. So Katrin Preller, over the past couple of years, has shown some really nice evidence that the connectivity of the thalamus to other brain regions changes with LSD, and specifically thalamic connectivity to sensory motor regions and primary sensory regions increases, whereas thalamic connectivity to transmodal regions may decrease. What this is suggesting is that psychedelics may disrupt the action of the thalamus in kind of filtering sensory information that is going to higher cognitive areas. And this disruption may lead to a flooding of the cortex of sensory information that then leads to all of the effects that we believe we understand during the acute effects of psychedelic drugs. Finally, one more theory that is beginning to evolve is a theory related to a brain structure called the claustrum. The claustrum is a really thin strip of gray matter tucked neatly between the internal capsule and the putamen within the brain. It's a unique region insofar as it has reciprocal connections to nearly all areas of cortex. Because of this really dense interconnectivity of the claustrum with everything else, some have hypothesized that this brain structure may play a key role in sustaining consciousness, such that Francis Crick, in his final scientific work, co-authored a paper with Christoph Koch in which they hypothesized that the colostrum was actually the seat of consciousness, or that it orchestrated consciousness. If we were to think of a brain region that could stitch together multisensory information as well as higher cognitive processes in a seamless percept that would then become the awareness that we all can experience. And this would be the ideal structure to do that. It's perfectly positioned to do that. More recent studies have shown that this may not be the case, at least not in the way that Crick and Koch originally conceived. But this is still a very interesting structure to us specifically because it is one of the brain regions that has the highest expression of serotonin 2A receptors. And these, again, are the target receptors of classic psychedelic drugs. It also has a dense expression of kappa opioid receptors, which are the targets of a couple of atypical hallucinogen drugs such as salvinorin A. And it may be deeply involved in response and especially changes in the prefrontal cortex that accompany administration of psychedelic drugs. Recently, we developed some methods to try to measure the activity and the connectivity of this brain region in humans. And then we extended that to measurements of brain function that were collected under the acute effects of psilocybin. And we demonstrated that psilocybin reduced colostrum connectivity to the frontoparietal task control network, which is involved in management of attention and direction of attentional and behavioral resources. We saw that colostrum connectivity to the auditory cortex and the default mode network were also reduced. And in particular, we observed that the default mode network integrity was actually associated with right colostrum connectivity to the default mode network, and frontoparietal task control network integrity was associated with right colostrum connectivity to this network. This is all to suggest that the colostrum may be involved in holding together these networks, and connectivity of the colostrum to these networks is being decreased by psilocybin. It may be that the colostrum is now well positioned to be orchestrating many of the changes that have been observed by others in terms of sensory changes in cognitive control, and changes in default mode network activity. These are all three models that still have a long way to go in terms of understanding the relationship to psychedelic effects and their position within psychedelic effects in the brain specifically, and potential therapeutic effects. But they all seem to be compelling models that may explain some aspect of psychedelic experience. The final discussion point in terms of the effects of psychedelic drugs on the brain specifically comes from our colleagues at UC Davis, in particular David Olson's lab, where he's demonstrated that the administration of a wide range of psychedelic drugs can essentially change neuroplasticity within the brain. He's shown an increase in synapse density, an increase in neurite density and neurite growth, and also the potential for recovering from the effects of social defeat stress on different brain structures. Essentially, he's suggesting that psychedelics may be psychoplastogens that increase neurite growth, spine density, and evoke synaptogenesis within the brain. And these brain changes may be the basis of the therapeutic effects that we see long-term after psychedelic experiences. One final reflection here. I've tried to give a really brief and high-level overview of what we know about psychedelics from modern empirical studies. A lot of claims have been made about psychedelics and consciousness, such that there are almost promises now out there that psychedelics are going to teach us something new or profound about consciousness or about the mind and the brain. But I think that it's clear that people may mean very different things when they use the word consciousness. Certainly some people, when they use the word consciousness, they're asking the question of whether someone's awake or asleep, or are they in a coma, or are they brain dead. These are different levels of consciousness that are certainly medically relevant, but I don't think everybody means that consciousness when they're talking about consciousness. I think people are far more aspirational and are talking about a far more philosophical concept of consciousness. At the completely other end of the spectrum from that medical consciousness, we have the felt sense of awareness, the qualia of being, and here we butt really straight up against the hard problem of consciousness, which is how can subjective experience arise from matter? How can that awareness be? Where is that awareness, and what is it like, and what is it made of, and all of these things? Backing off of that hard problem of consciousness, we have some more easy problems of consciousness that involve questions such as, what are the contents of consciousness, and how does the brain represent these contents of consciousness, and what is accessible to conscious awareness, and how does conscious or unconscious awareness affect attention, memory, emotion, and decision making? These questions are squarely within the realm and within the range of modern psychology, neuroscience, and other such disciplines. I would argue that psychedelics may help us to deepen our understanding of aspects of consciousness within the scope of the easy problem. But I don't believe there's any reason to think that there's anything about psychedelics that will bring us any closer to understanding or cracking the hard problem of consciousness, at least no closer than any other tools we have at our disposal. And I hope to engage in much more conversation about that and truly learn a lot more about whatever we can in the future using psychedelic drugs as scientific tools. Thank you for your time and attention.
I wish to thank Ajid and Pascal for their invitation to speak at this CARTA meeting on altered states of the human mind. And the topic of my presentation is on cognitive enhancement, including nicotine, caffeine, cocaine, amphetamine, and general anesthesia. The psychostimulants or cognitive enhancer alter the states of the human mind, and they are known to be drugs that are pleasurable or invigorating, which include smart drugs, cognitive enhancers, and all these drugs are claimed to improve the cognitive function, particularly the executive ones, the memory, the creativity or motivation. And this include, of course, well-known compounds like cocaine, which leads to increase of alertness, feeling of well-being, euphoria, which cause increased energy and motor activity, feelings of competence, and even enhance sexual vigor. There is also amphetamine, which improve cognition, inhibitory control, episodic and working memory, attention, performance of effortful task. Modafinil is a curious drug. It's a wakefulness-promoting agent, which increase alertness, particularly in sleep-deprived individuals, and which enhance some executive function, facilitates reasoning and problem-solving. Last, caffeine, which increase alertness, as everybody knows, and nicotine, which improves alerting and orienting attention and episodic and working memory. These compounds are known since, for some of them, the Paleolithic in humans. They are very old. One can find some of them in even mummies in ancient Egypt. And the general idea is that this consumption of drugs, which is commonly done in several societies, contribute to social and group solidarity, to join people together and their relationship within the society. Now, the main message of my presentation is that drugs are social representation of brain chemistry. In anthropology, it is known that nicotine, for instance, is used as the chewing plant with tobacco, and by Aboriginal groups of Central Australia. They cause some kind of trance-like states in these human beings, and allow Aboriginal population to, as they say, run hundreds of kilometers without food or water to excite their courage in warfare, and they also cause some kind of habituation or addiction, which is well known with nicotine. So this traditional use of nicotine is a good example of how some of these enhancing drugs are being used by some population in the world, like cocaine as well, in South America, where it is well known that from Andean workers, since about 3,000 years, these compounds are being used, cocaine is used to reduce fatigue, to improve the mood, and also, again, increase sexual vigor. The mechanism of action of these cognitive enhancing drugs is to affect the chemistry of the brain. And to understand their mode of action, we have to realize that our brain is made up of nerve cells, and that these nerve cells make networks of connections. And this network of connections are established at the level of synapses, of contacts, and that you shall see here in this slide. And these contacts, which are the size of bacteria, about 1 micrometer, you can see that the space between the two cells is empty, if I may say. And in fact, in this empty space, some chemical substances called neurotransmitters are released and affect the other side of the synapse. So there is a chemical communication between the nerve cells, which is taking place through compounds which are referred to as neurotransmitters, and some of them are acetylcholine, and here norepinephrine, dopamine, or amino acids like GABA or glycine or glutamate, and even polypeptide. And in fact, one often thinks about the brain as being an electrical system. Here we see it as a chemical system of intercellular communications. Now, the cognitive enhancers, I just mentioned at the beginning of my talk, are, if you wish, considered as mimicking the neurotransmitters and the brain own chemical, like, for instance, Nicotiana tabacum, which is from which nicotine is being extracted, produce, in fact, a compound here, which is an analog of acetylcholine. The coffee produces caffeine, and which is an analog of adenosine, and from the coca plant is extracted cocaine, which like amphetamine and monafenil, is some kind of structural analog of noradrenaline, another neurotransmitter. And now, in the case of the general anesthetics, which in fact create loss of consciousness, like desfuran and propofol, the idea is that these compounds are mimicking, to some extent, the interface between leaking and proteins. So there are some structural analogies between these drugs, these cognitive enhancers, and general anesthetics, which is, again, a class of compound which is having, if I may say, simply the opposite of the cognitive enhancers. Now, some of these cognitive enhancers target the synapse at the presynaptic level, the other at the postsynaptic one. And for instance, in the case of cocaine and amphetamine, it is well known that they act on the presynaptic transporter of neurotransmitter, while in the case of nicotine and caffeine, they act on the receptors from the neurotransmitter in the opposite side of the synapse. So, in a general manner, the cognitive enhancer act either pre or post synaptically, and therefore modify the action of the neurotransmitter or the level of the neurotransmitter in the cleft in the synapse. Now, if you look more carefully at the effect of nicotine, for example, you ask where does it act on the postsynaptic receptor, and studies on the atomic structure of the receptor for nicotine, which is a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which is associated with an ion channel. You can see here that nicotine is acting at the level of the acetylcholine binding site, the neurotransmitter binding site. Now, if you look at caffeine, it is also acting on the adenosine receptor, and which is a receptor different from the nicotinic receptor in the sense that it is linked to G protein. It's a metabotropic receptor. This is a ionotropic receptor. And as you can see very easily on this slide, at the atomic level, the caffeine is acting at the same place as the neurotransmitter adenosine and take its place, in fact. So another aspect which is interesting is that the receptor may exist either on active on resting conformation, and in fact what nicotine does is to stabilize the active state, and in the case of caffeine is the opposite, the antagonism of the receptor conformation. And in both cases, actually, there is some kind of excitatory effect resulting. Now, this is the case of nicotine and caffeine. Now, if you look at cocaine, as I said, it's acting presynaptically, and it's known to block the transport of the neurotransmitter. As you can see here, the protein to which it's bound is a very complex protein which has many transmembrane helices, and this is the structure of this transporter, and you can see here clearly that the cocaine block the transport of dopamine, and as a consequence of that, there is an accumulation of the neurotransmitter dopamine here in the synaptic cleft, and therefore some kind of potentiation of this particular type of synapse through the accumulation of the neurotransmitter. So both cocaine, amphetamine, and compound related to them, like modafinil, in fact cause some enhancement through this increase of the local concentration of the neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. Now, I mentioned that the general anesthetics were in fact having a general depressing effect in the whole brain compared to the enhancers, and their study again the atomic level of receptors in the brain have been extensively studied, and one can see here that contrary to what caffeine or nicotine is doing, these compounds are blocking two special sites here, which are at the interface between the lipids and protein. At the level of these sites, they modulate the activity of the receptor. And here, for instance, in the case of the inhibitory receptor, which is the receptor for gamma. They potentiate these receptors, they potentiate inhibition. And while the cognitive enhancer increase the excitation of the brain, here they block it and cause, in fact, a general inhibition at the level of the cortex, as we shall see now. To further understand the mode of action of these drugs, one can explore their action globally at the level of the human brain and in particular the states of the human mind. And first of all, it is well known that we may undergo states of wakefulness and sleep, which alter during day and night. And these effects are under the control of a set of neurons from the ascending reticular formation here, which include compounds, which are some of those I mentioned, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and glutamate. These neurotransmitters contribute to the alternance of wakefulness and sleep, and this manifests itself by some kind of, during wakefulness, an enhanced microcircuitry in the neuron of the cerebral cortex, in relation with those underlying the cortex, which is the thalamus. So there is some kind of thalamocortical oscillation which are taking place, while during sleep there are very different, slower oscillations which are taking place. Now, in addition to these control of wakefulness and sleep, there are other systems called reward systems, which are, for instance, associated with circuits including dopamine. And here you can also see how these neurons can innervate here the whole cerebral cortex and alter the state of the human mind, in addition to the wakefulness and sleep. So the idea that have been proposed to account for the general architecture of the human mind is that, in addition to these vertical architectures, as you saw, these controlling the wakefulness and sleep and reward, there are horizontal architectures which are concerned by the content of the human mind, or what one is called, if you wish, the content of consciousness. And the idea is that there are some neurons with long-range axons which link different territory of the cerebral cortex, as you see here, which create some kind of brain scale network, and we call this kind of network the global neuronal workspace, with Stanislas Dehaene and myself. And here you can see that when you see a brain imaging of brain of some person being conscious and awake, you can see that when this person is looking at a word, reads a word, then there are plenty of territories of the cerebral cortex which are activated. And when conditions are such that there is some non-conscious or subliminal perception, then you can see that the activation of this global workspace is decreased, and one may view the enhancement of the of the human brain due to, at least in part, the activation of this global neuronal workspace. And this is, for instance, illustrated in the case of cocaine enhancement. And here, if you look at the behavioral rating caused by cocaine infusion, you see here the euphoria or rush, which is caused by cocaine, and as a consequence, you see these regions which are partly, some of them I illustrated in the previous slide, which are activated, and you may do brain imaging under this condition and see that in addition to this activation, which involve in particular the cingulate cortex, and there are reward circuits which are also activated that you can see here on this slide. And what you may even say that cocaine enhancement is some kind of overrunning of the global neuronal workspace, in particular by the reward rush circuits. So this is some kind with some ignition which is taking place in the situation of, for instance, ecstasy or other syndromes like the one of Stendhal in front of the of a beautiful piece of art. So this situation in the case of cocaine may have at least some common points, even though it's quite different from the mechanism of enhancement by nicotine. And here again, you can see that if you scan the brain in the presence of nicotine, this is a placebo, you have this enhanced global workspace which is taking place, and this is due to the activation of the nicotinic receptor in the frontal part, in particular of the cerebral cortex, and through some kind of disinhibition of the principal neuron of the cerebral cortex, which are the pyramidal cells. This is again manifesting itself by some kind of enhancement of the activity of the global neuronal workspace. This is again an interpretation, but at least at this stage, this is what one can propose. Now, in the case of general anesthesia, that's the reason why I insisted that one should include in this presentation general anesthesia compared to enhancement, is that in the case of their EEG recordings, like electroencephalography, you can see that after application of general anesthetics, you reach a state where you have a slow oscillation compared to the wake state, and resemble to some extent the sleep kind of organization of the EEG. And now again, looking at brain imaging, you find that here, instead of enhancement of this workspace, you see a decrease of general activity of this cortical global circuit, in contrast with the effect of brain enhancers. One of the difficulty of using these drugs, as you may know, even a danger, is that many of the cognitive enhancers lead to addiction, and there to an alteration of activity of the brain, and for instance of the prefrontal cortex, which I mentioned before, which in addicted subjects is down-regulated. Last slide concerns the enhancement and society. These cognitive enhancers are I just mentioned. For instance, nicotine can be used in some patients which have cognitive deficits like Alzheimer and Parkinson's disease. Now, amphetamines can be used in adults with ADHD symptoms, and in particular in and Ritalin, which is somewhat similar to cocaine. Now there is, of course, unfortunately, some military use, like modafinil to keep soldiers awake in battlegrounds. Also, Captagon is used by the terrorists from the jihad to resist fatigue and also have, if I may say, some kind of loss of judgment. And there were also many studies which were done quite a while ago about some kind of behavioral engineering of humans for the development of mind-controlling drugs. Last but not least, one should have in mind the issue of transhumanism and the augmented human brain. And I think this is some kind of utopia to artificially improve the human brain to make it better than the neural brain. Then, of course, the risk is to have these dangers of chronic drug treatments, including addiction and many alterations which accompany the use of these drugs. So, as Andrew Russell was saying, this simply manifests the immaturity of people from the Silicon Valley to believe that they are going to improve globally the possibility of the human brains. Thank you very much.